Okay, just a couple of notes here about the material that you have in your hands. Of course, this is a walk through the Gospels. Hopefully you've had the opportunity to get the gist of it. On page 1 of that material, we've just got a brief introduction. And we've got a graph that breaks down the 4 different Gospel accounts, who wrote them, who they were writing to, some key words or thoughts in all of those things. We will come back to that chart, Lord willing, throughout our study. Hopefully you've been able to decipher this big graph that starts out on page 2. It's really just a harmony of the 4 Gospels. We've got 4 Gospel accounts, all kind of like bees buzzing around the flower. There's just one flower, but they're all approaching from different angles. And at times they're repetitive because they're telling the same story just from different angles for different audiences. And you can see we are in week 1, which means according to our graph that we are in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18. Lord willing, next Sunday morning we will be in week 2, and you can see that we will cover some of the Gospel of Matthew, some of the Gospel of Luke. Lord willing, we will do that as we walk all the way through the Gospels. If you'll turn in that packet back to page 18, one other note of explanation before we get into our text. This packet that we've been handing out the last couple of weeks, this will take us, Lord willing, through the end of March. Okay, we've got 13 weeks from page 18 in that packet back through page 30. I've got the opportunity there for you just to write the date directly under week 1, week 2, so on and so forth. And we've got the same 6 basic questions all the way through. Okay? 6 things that you can personalize as you do your reading and studying in this packet. 6 different questions to get you into the text, to get you thinking about what's being talked about. And if you do those things and do that reading, then you'll definitely be ready to participate in our class each Sunday morning. One other thing, Marcus has been handing out our reading calendars for the month of January. If you did not get those, we'll be handing those out as well as you leave the auditorium this morning. They'll be back on the visitors table in the foyer. A little different setup than we've had the last couple of years. That reading schedule actually complements what we're studying in this Sunday morning class. Okay? If you've got that calendar, you can see on tomorrow, January 4th, we will read once again John 1, 1 to 18, just in case people have not had the opportunity to do that. And then we'll start on what the class material lists as week 2. We'll read 3 different Psalms a week. Psalm 1 on Tuesday, Psalm 2 on Thursday, Psalm 3 Saturday. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays we're reading through the book of Psalms. And as you look down through that calendar, there are obviously some scriptures that are outside of the Gospels, but they complement what we are reading. For instance, if John says Jesus did this to fulfill what Isaiah said at some point in that week, we'll go back and we'll actually read what Isaiah said in his context. And whatever it is on that calendar for that week will one way or another complement our adult Bible study for the upcoming Sunday. Okay? So, you do that reading, you look at those 6 questions, and you will be amply prepared to come together and talk about our study on Sunday mornings. If you want to go back to page 18 in your material, that is where we are, week number 1. And we start out in John's Gospel. We're going to get to John 1 in just a moment. Before we get there, if you go back with me to John chapter 20, that is actually where we are going to start out at the end of John's Gospel. John, from the very beginning, as we will see in a moment, isn't shy about telling us who this story is about. In John chapter 20, he kind of recaps where he has been. And he says in John 20 and verse 30, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in His name. Now maybe the knee-jerk reaction of someone who isn't very grounded is to read John 20, verses 30 and 31 and think, well, I already believe that Jesus is the Christ. I've got that. I confessed that belief a long time ago. And so, what John is talking about here is really kind of elementary. I'm going to go back to Romans, or I'm going to go back to Hebrews. Why is that a wrong way of looking at this account? What do you think John means in John 20, verses 30 and 31? Nancy?
Making a point, Jason, that they couldn't possibly write down everything that Christ did.
Okay.
That they wrote down enough that we can believe and accept.
Okay. The things that have been recorded were recorded for a reason, and there are lots of other things that could have been recorded. Dave, go ahead.
Kind of like the core of the basis.
Okay. Okay.
What we are fundamentals.
Here's the foundation or the root of what is to come. Any other thoughts? Go ahead.
I find that when I read John, it's different than the other Gospels because it delves so much deeper into the personal mind and heart of Jesus Christ and who He really was.
Yeah. There's meat here. No doubt about it. Let's go back to John 15 and show why that is a wrong way of looking at the gospel accounts, in addition to what has already been brought up. It's the idea that I would not just believe at some point in the past and then move beyond that, right? It is the core, as Dave brought up, it is the foundation. This was not written only to provoke initial belief, but to keep me on believing. Right? And John 15 kind of has that flavor. We start in John 15 and verse 5. Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. There is an initial conviction where I come to believe this is the Christ, the anointed one of God, the deliverer, the very Son of God. And now I'm not only called to be convicted by that and say, I believe that, but I'm called to allow this person and His words to abide in me. And if I do not do that, that's a very unpleasant thought, what he's saying in John 15, right? We go back to John chapter 8 very quickly. Same kind of thing in John 8 verses 31 and 32 that show us why treating the Gospels as if, well, that's elementary and I've moved beyond that, and so I'm looking for some meat, is a very, very inaccurate way of looking at what we're studying in this particular class. John 8:31, Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in Him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. Somebody give me just a basic idea of what it means to abide in my word. Gordon?
Do the best you can to make Christ's way your way.
Yeah.
Your life. You follow in His footsteps. You study it, you understand it, you do it.
Okay. I want to walk like He walked, and I want to think like He thinked, and I thought, and I want to react the way that He reacted, and I want to interact with people the way that He interacted with other people. And the way that I'm going to learn to model Him is to take what He said and get it in my mind and allow it to work on my heart, and I'm going to meditate on it, and I'm going to allow it to shape me and mold me and reprove me and correct me. And the more that I meditate on it and have it abide in my head, and I try and abide in what He has said, I'll grow to be like Him. But if I say, well, yeah, I believe that He lived, and I believe all these things, and I definitely believe in heaven, and I've got all that down, and just move on, I got a problem with my perspective, for sure. John is writing that we might believe and keep on believing in what he said. Let's go back to John 21 here very quickly. John is writing as an eyewitness. Very, very important point for us to get in our heads. 5 different times in this gospel we read about the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's John. Okay, in John chapter 21 and verse 20, there at the end of the gospel, Peter turned and he saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. The one who had been reclining at the table close to Jesus. We read earlier in the gospel, he was close enough to lean his head on Jesus' shoulder. And he said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? John was right there on that occasion. Look 4 verses later at John 21 and verse 24. This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is sure. This is a close account. This is not the account of someone that came 100 years later and who's digging through the accounts of other people trying to trace exactly what went on. He was there. Okay? Of all of them, kind of as Chuck brought out, this is probably the closest of the eyewitness accounts. John is right there all along the way. Okay, let's go back to our text in John chapter 1. John 1, and we start out in verse 1. First 5 words, so very, very, very important. In the beginning was the Word. That's 6 words, isn't it? I wasn't thinking about was. That's 6 words. First 6 words, extremely important. In the beginning was the Word. What do you think about when you look just at those first 3 words of John 1:1? In the beginning of what? And somebody mumbled Genesis, right? Genesis 1:1. In the beginning. John 1:1. In the beginning. And it's evident, isn't it, that John must have that kind of thing in mind, because Genesis 1:1 is all about what? God, the beginning, creation. Okay? John 1:1 is all about what? God, the beginning, creation. We've got this idea from the very beginning in talking about this Word. This is not just an ordinary story of some good teacher who lived about 2,000 years ago who had some good things to say. Okay? The most important thing he's going to say about this Word, I would argue, is John 1:14. We'll talk about it in more detail in just a moment. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. You keep your finger there and turn back real quick to 1 John chapter 1 and verse 1. Same writer, same beginning point. Speaking again to why he's writing the things that he's writing and why he's writing them in the way that he wrote them. 1 John 1 and verse 1, look at the language. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. What does John want to make sure you get at the beginning of everything that he writes? He was there and he saw it, he touched him, and he was incredible. John wants you to read this in wonder. Okay? He wants you to read this stunned and worshipful. There isn't any mystery. He could have written this account the way a lot of accounts are. You know, you start out in the beginning of this person's life here on the earth and talk about where he was born and what it was like on that occasion. And, you know, you kind of chart it the way a typical biography is charted. And you don't really know who this person grows to be until, you know, maybe halfway or 3/4 through the story. Not John. John wants you to understand from first word, this was incredible, and I was there, and I saw it, and you need to read this, and it ought to blow your mind. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about from the very beginning. This was the main character, and he didn't just live, and you can't just read about him. He made you. Okay? Isn't that the point from the very beginning? John 1 and verse 1, back to our text. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything, including you and me, that was made. In Him was life. And the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Okay, one other question here before we move on a little. Why Word? The Word. I mean, we could put in there, in the beginning was the vine, or the door, or any number of things that Jesus Himself compares Himself to. Why do you think the phrase, the Word? Gordon?
Well, I've always thought, I'm not sure, but I've always thought it was because when God spoke the Word, things happened.
Okay.
And it was through speaking, and then comes over into the New Testament, the only way things are going to happen is for people to speak.
Okay. Going back to the theme of creation, God spoke and things happened. In the beginning, God said, let there be light, and there was light. Okay? Good point. Zippy, go ahead.
When I was a new Christian, I was wondering about that, why they call it the Word, the whole book. I got to thinking, it's probably one of the more versatile words to think about. Word. God's Word.
Okay.
The Word means when you give somebody your word, okay, it's a promise. There's another meaning of it. The plurality of the word is, you can take that into many concepts to describe what this really means. And every one of them, when you apply it, clearly depicts what is meant when God basically does anything. When you want to talk about the Bible and how God's precepts are put forth.
Okay. Let's go back to John chapter 14. It's a very versatile word. It's something that can be used, like Zippy has said, in a lot of different contexts. John 14, in verse 6, familiar statement of Jesus. where He says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Now keep that in mind, and you couple it with what He said in John 18. Turn over there to John chapter 18 and verse 37. Basic question that was asked, right? John 18 and verse 37. Pilate said to Him, so you are a king? Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. One occasion, I am the truth. On another occasion, I have come to bear witness of the truth. Okay? Keep that basic pairing in your mind. Let's go back to John 8:31, another pairing here, and then we'll look at one more and talk a little bit more about this word. John 8:31. Jesus says to the Jews who had believed in Him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. Okay? Second part of the pairing in John 15 and verse 7. Turn over there. If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, He says in John chapter 8. In John 15 and verse 7, if you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. Abide in my word. Allow my words to abide in you. If the truth abides in you. One other coupling. Let's go back to John chapter 5 and the 36th verse of the chapter. John chapter 5 and verse 36. I want you to see, like Zippy has said, how this idea is used very versatilely throughout the gospel. John 5 and verse 36. But the testimony that I have is greater than that of John, for the works that the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I am doing, bear witness about me that the Father has sent me. My works that I'm doing bear witness about me. Second part of this last coupling in John chapter 10 and verse 25. John chapter 10 and verse 25. Jesus answers while He's there in Jerusalem, I told you and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me. Okay? Couple of different couplings there where He talks about the Word. I am the Word and I want my words to abide in you. I am the truth, and the truth that I'm saying bears witness about me. Look at these works that I'm able to do. They bear witness to who I am, and these works bear witness to where I have come from. You put all of that together, and what is Jesus trying to get across to these people? Chuck asked or stated an interesting thing when we asked about John 1 and verse 1, in the beginning. In the beginning of what? Jesus is claiming, obviously, not just to be the Word. There's something that goes beyond this world, right? And goes beyond the moment here. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a moment. I would encourage you to think about what we read in John 14 and John 18 and John 8 and 15 and 5 and 10. And you think about who's behind what Jesus is saying and doing. Is it just a human being coming up with some pretty radical things to do?
God.
No. God is behind what's going on here, right? And when we think about the people that Jesus comes to, God had spoken with them in a variety of different ways, right? Hebrews 1 comes out and talks about how God in ancient times spoke through patriarchs and He spoke through prophets. But now in these last days, God has spoken to us through whom? Through His Son. And so you've got 2/3 of this book that we call the Bible, and we've got all of the patriarchs, and we've got the prophets, and we've got these kings. But when God has, in a sense, the final, definitive thing to say to the world, He does it through His Son. Through the Word. What God had to say to the world in the fullness of time, Jesus says, listen to the things that I'm saying and look at the things that I am doing. This is what God wants to say to the world at the fullness of time, at the apex of His plan. Look at what I'm doing. Listen to what I'm saying. This is the Word, the communication of God to you in the greatest of senses. The decisive message of God. That's Jesus. In what He said and in what He did. Okay? Back in our text, John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay? We're going to read later on in John's Gospel these scandalous things that he says in the minds of the Jews. Things like, before Abraham was, I am. Now in English that sounds, grammatically awkward. What does that mean? What was Jesus saying? I mean, when you think of Abraham, he's everything, right? To the Jews, Father Abraham. What does Jesus mean when He says, before Abraham was, I am?
He was always there.
Okay?
When Moses was talking in the bush and they sent him back to the people in Egypt, He says, who shall I say sent me?
Yeah.
What is your name? And He says, I am.
Yeah.
So Jesus is saying, I am.
I've always been, I am, I always will be. There's not, some timeline with a beginning and an end. You and I have a tough time wrapping our little finite minds around that because everything has a beginning and everything has an end, right? In this world. Not Jesus. Jesus was born into this world, yes. But before He was born, He is. Okay? Before Abraham was, He is. Before anything was made, He is. Always has been. Always will be. In relationship to God, He was God. When we talk about this one who walked among us, He was and is and always will be God. And finally, in His relationship to the world, look at verse 6. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. We'll talk a lot more about him. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and He didn't just come to the world. He just wasn't in the world for a little while. He made the world before He came to it. Yet the world did not know Him. He came to His own, and His own people did not receive Him. But to all who did receive Him, who believed in His name, He gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood. Everyone here was born of blood, right? Doesn't take anything religious to be born of blood. That's a very natural process, right? But in order to become a child of God, you're not just born of blood at the beginning of your walk here on the earth. You're born not of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but you're born of God. This Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen His glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John, whom we'll talk about, bore witness about Him and cried out, "This was He of whom I said, He who comes after me ranks before me, because He was before me." Who was born physically of blood first? Jesus or John? John. And yet John says, before I was, He was. And He is. Just because I'm older doesn't mean anything. And from His fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, He has made Him known. Let's end, if you go back to John chapter 14. Turn back there to John chapter 14 to kind of tie in what we just read. John wants you to know, and of course this is true of what we'll study, Lord willing, next Sunday morning in Matthew's Gospel and in Luke's Gospel. John wants you to know that this is not just things that I remember that I decided to jot down before I forgot them. Okay? Why ought I to listen to this? Why is this even important? John 14 and verse 26 tells me why it is important. Promise of Jesus to His apostles. John was right there. One of the things that John heard with his own ears was the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name. He will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said. One other one in John chapter 16 and the 13th verse of the chapter. Same context, same kind of promise. Let's start in verse 12. John 16 and verse 12. I still have many things to say to you, Jesus says, but you cannot bear them now. When the Spirit of truth comes, He will guide you into all the truth. For He will not speak on His own authority, but whatever He hears, He will speak, and He will declare to you the things that are to come. Now, you take that promise in John 14 and the promise in John 16, and then we remember why John says he wrote this book. There were many other signs that He did in the presence of the disciples that aren't written here, but these are written so that you may believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in His name. Where did John get what he's writing? Well, two sources. He's an eyewitness, right? He can testify, this is what happened. This is what I heard. This is what I saw. But who's ultimately behind the recording even of this gospel? God. The Spirit of God, right? What I encourage you to remember as you read this week in Matthew's Gospel and in Luke's Gospel and beyond, these men want you to read this in wonder and awe. It is so easy for us who are so very familiar with what we're reading. Yeah, I've heard that before. And to lose the sense of awe and wonder at what is recorded here. Don't miss that, okay? Don't just read this to have read it as an intellectual exercise. Be in awe of the kinds of things that we're reading. Thank you for being here. Lord willing, we'll pick back up next Sunday morning.